One thing that struck me with Houdini 18.5 is how side effects spent some time developing a few nifty user-friendly tools that make it easy and almost downright fun to work in simulations. And one of those tools is the Vellum Brush. To check that out, I'm going to drop down a geonode, dive in there, and in here I'm just going to use a font node to generate some geometry. In this case I'll just type out the word cloth in all caps and set the font to maybe a Chivo, that's the one we're using in presentations, Chivo Black Italic, that's this thing. And then I'm going to use a poly extrude node to extrude this, give this a bit of depth, 0.2 units maybe, and I want to make sure that down here output back is checked, so I'm getting a fully enclosed geometry like this. Later, for shading this in Karma, I'm going to need UVs, so I'll just attach a UV quick shade to display if and which UVs I have on the geometry. In this case, I don't have proper UVs, so let's fix that by wiring in a UV texture in between the font and the poly extrude. Set this to project along the Z-axis, and maybe scale this to 4 units or maybe 4.5. So we're getting almost quadratic UVs here. Next, as I want to pipe this into Vellum, I need this to be a uniformly subdivided mesh, for which I want to use the remesh node. However, if I wire this in between here, you can see that even if we scale back the target size to 0.02, you can see at these edges we're getting UV errors. To fix those, for the remesh I'll wire in a split UV seams node, goes in here. So now those faces will be treated individually from the extrusion sides here. Let's just in the remesh increase the iterations to maybe 8, so we're getting a more uniform mesh. However, now we split apart those individual pieces of our extrusion, so let's fuse them together using a fuse node. And I'll set the snap distance to maybe 0.01, like this. All right, I'll use this in my Vellum simulation, so I'm going to configure this, set this up as a Vellum cloth, using the Vellum cloth constraint node here, and then drop down a Vellum brush, wire this up like this, and highlight it. And what the Vellum brush allows me to do is, if I have the tool handle selected here, to drag around this geometry, and Vellum will automatically simulate the behavior of this geometry. So when I right-click in the viewport, I can see the options for that tool here. So I've got different modes. Now I'm brushing this. I also can just drag around those points. It goes a bit like this. I can contract and expand. So usually contraction works by just left mouse clicking in here, and expansion works by control left mouse clicking in here. Also, I can rotate this. So again, left mouse click rotates clockwise, control mouse click counterclockwise. I can crease and ruffle this, one of my favorite functions. So creasing works by middle mouse clicking in here, and ruffling by control clicking to the areas I want to ruffle, like this. Finally, I can enable or disable collisions to speed up the simulation a bit and select the area on which we're going to work. So set to screen, we're just going to project our tool handle into the scene here and select anything that's behind it. A volume just selects this volume here that's within this sphere. Surface just selects all those surfaces that are within those spheres. There's the nearest point selection, so we're just gonna pick one point here, and we can increase that radius as well. And finally, connected geometry, which will select a whole connected geometry, in this case each letter, like so, which is going to be useful in a second. Let's reset all those changes we did here and work with our initial geometry. So what I want to do first is maybe use the brush tool a bit, and I like to work in screen mode usually to give this letter a bit of clothy appearance, a bit of crumpliness, maybe something like this. Now, if I want to work on the next letter here, you will see that this letter also keeps relaxing as it's part of a simulation that is still running. So let's Control Z to undo this and maybe work on this part here a bit still. And assuming I found a shape that I like, what I want to do is pin those points forming this letter, so they are not influenced by my actions with the cloth brush. To do that, I need to shift and middle mouse click on the parts of the geometry that I want to pin, and you can see I can brush those in. However, brushing in those individual letters is a bit tedious, so let's undo this. And instead, right-click in the viewport here, and as my brush shape, select Connected Geometry. And now if I shift middle mouse click on the connected geometry of one of those letters, you can see I'm directly pinning the whole geometry here. That's very useful. Okay, got this C pinned here, and I accidentally moved it up a bit. So let's drag it back down by holding the middle mouse button with those pinned points here and just dragging them down. Okay, let's go back to screen and work on our L here, maybe in drag mode, maybe like this. Again, shift middle mouse on this to pin it. And I want to be in the connected geometry again, like so, and middle mouse and drag it down there to where I like it. Next, let's work on the O. So again, I'm going to go to screen mode here and use the rotate brush here to give this a bit of a swirl. And maybe let's expand this a bit by control clicking in here and again, rotating it a bit. Okay, fine like that. Again, going to go to connected geometry mode and shift and middle mouse click in here to pin those points and then drag with middle mouse button to move this O where I want it. I don't know, maybe here. Okay, let's work on the T, again using creasing and ruffles, and set this to screen mode. Creasing and ruffles is my favorite mode because, well, it makes it very easy to create ruffles by holding down Control and then adding those in those areas where I like to. And also, if they are not as ruffly as I would want them to be, let's just undo those few here. I can increase the ruffle scale here to, say, 1.5. So again, Control clicking in here, and now that looks a bit better. Okay, again, connected geometry, shift middle mouse to pin those, and then drag with the middle mouse button to any position I like. And maybe let's just, again, middle mouse drag this O down here. I don't know, something that doesn't look super terrible. And let's finally work on the H here with a combination of techniques. Again, gonna use the screen mode here. Maybe something like that. And you know the drill, connected geometry, shift middle mouse to pin this, and then middle mouse drag it to the position where I want this thing to live. Maybe like so. Let's just save this. And as this mesh is rather coarse, let's give it a bit more detail by using the Vellum Post process and add some subdivisions. As these are triangles, I'm going to use the loop subdivision and maybe add a tiny bit of spatial blur. So that's looking neat. Let's attach a null to this one here. Call this one out so we find it more easily later. So to render this, I want to use Karma. It's still in beta, but I think you can see some progress. It's been way more stable for me. Still not the fastest engine, but it comes with Houdini and is a nice alternative to Mantra. So let's head over to our Solaris, and in here we'll set up our scene for rendering. So first I want to import the geometry using a SOP import, pointing it to the out null we just created here, which brings in my cloth letters here. Next, I want to attach a material to this, so I'm going to use a material library node for this, in which I will create a principled shader. And as this is cloth, I downloaded a few cloth textures from Texture Haven. They are free to use, so a very neat site. Just going to use the base color texture and select the file here. So a black and white fabric pattern here. And also in the bumps and normals, I want to enable the normal mapping and select a texture here. And luckily for me, my cloth texture came with a normal map here. I think we don't need it as strong, so effect scale of 0.2 is fine for now. Let's go back to the stage and assign this material to our geometry. By default, the material library is set up to assign any VOP that we have in here to our geometry. So as we have only one material VOP in here, that's fine. However, we need to point it to the scene element that we want to assign this material to. In this case, I'll just go with all geometry primitives. We can see now we've got this coarse cloth texture on here. Next, I'll create a camera, just control clicking on the camera icon here, which will place a camera in my scene at the viewport camera's position. Just going to lock my camera to the viewport so I can move it around now. Finally, I'll add an environment light, and in this dome light setting, under the base properties, I'll select an HDR. Just selecting this HDR, which I downloaded for free. Now I might want to add some background, so just drop down a grid, dive in there, and set up this grid to be along the X and Y plane axes. Go up again, and maybe also give this thing a material, just copying over this material node, wiring it in here. And down here, let's call this principled shader BG for background, and uncheck the base color textures and also uncheck the normals. Maybe on the surface settings, let's disable the reflectivity, dial that back to 0, and let's also dial down the base color to a dark gray. Okay, back up, and let's merge this. Maybe before we created the camera. So down here, let's create a merge node and wire in my two geometries like that. And now let's highlight the dome light. To finally start rendering, let's switch our viewport over to Karma. And after a short while, we can see an image that's way too dark. So let's increase our light intensity here to maybe 8. And now I want to dial back the reflectivity of this cloth material here. So in here, under the surface tab, let's increase the roughness to 0.5, decrease the IOR to 1.3, and let's also decrease the reflectivity to 0.3. So my cloth is looking better now. Then I want to dial back the brightness of the background here. I want to make this darker. So in my BG material here, in the base color, let's set to be 0.02. Yep, I like that better. And finally, I want to still increase my dome light's intensity to maybe 10. Maybe even 15, like so. Finally, to render this, I can either use the Karma ROP, so just the Karma node here, and render this to disk directly, or what I often like to do when doing a look dev in Solaris here is just use the Karma render properties and then have this rendered to my viewport, and then just using the snapshot strip to take snapshots of this render and save them to disk. Just drag this down, and in here in my Karma render properties, let's first increase the resolution to 1920 by 1080. And this resolution is what the image will be rendered at here. So even though this viewport now is smaller than this full HD resolution, Houdini still renders this image at full HD and then scales it down to the viewport. So if I snapshot it and then save it, it's going to be full HD. Maybe I'll increase the pixel samples a bit. And in the limits, let's drag this down. Let's give this a few more diffuse bounces, maybe 4. And it might even, I think it could even be a bit brighter. So in the dome light, let's give this an intensity of 20. So I think I'll continue working on this a bit, tweaking the geometry a bit, brushing away, maybe adding a few more secondary geometries in here, and then tweaking shading, lighting, rendering a bit further. And I'm going to provide you with that scene file that comes out of this. So the cloth brush, a really nice and fun tool to use, especially handy if you need some quick pieces of fabric for some set dressing or a quick fabric geometry for some still frames. And also Karma is coming along nicely. I think it's rightfully still being called beta, but it's definitely way more stable than it used to be in 18.0. So I think now is the right time to give it a try and just get your feet wet with it. That being said, if you want to learn more about rendering in general, if you plainly want to support us, and while doing so gaining access to more in-depth courses, consider becoming a patron of ours. And to everyone already supporting us, thanks so much. Without your support, Entagma would not be possible. And a very special thank you goes out to Important Looking Pirates, Patrick Fillion, Chris Hebert, and Rafika Nadal. Thanks so much, guys.